and welcome to On Closer Inspection, the weekly current affairs programme here on Made in Leeds. This is the show where we look at the biggest stories developing in the city and talk to the people with something to say about them. Coming up on today's show. In the week that Syria is top of the national news agenda, Leeds prepares to accept up to 200 Syrian refugees. We'll be taking a more detailed look at what's been done here in the city to support them, and we'll also be finding out about daily life for refugees and asylum seekers in the city. And it's National Empty Homes Week. With over 5,500 empty properties in Leeds, we'll hear what's been done to try and get some of those houses back into use as homes. First though to Syria and the impact of the European refugee crisis here in Leeds. This week, German Chancellor Angela Merkel has held a mini-summit to look at deals with some EU countries and Turkey to house hundreds of thousands of refugees each year. It's estimated that around 2.5 million Syrians have fled their homelands since the current crisis there started. Of course, here in the UK this week, the House of Commons will decide whether or not to start airstrikes against IS in Syria, who are widely blamed, of course, for driving so many out of the country in the first place. And I should say that we're filming this the day of the debate. Well, Prime Minister David Cameron has committed to allow 20,000 Syrian refugees to come to the UK, and Leeds City Council has said it will take in 200 of those refugees. That's the figure that it feels Leeds can take without additional pressure on services. But is that figure of 200 too high, or is the third largest city in the country far too low? Well, we'll be talking here in the studio with representatives of organisations that work with and for refugees. But first, some more details.
It is now time for us to do our bit in Syria. And that is why I ask my colleagues to vote for this motion tonight.
A scene uncommon in the House of our elected representatives. Not just the sustained applause, but the fact that those doing the clapping sat on both sides of the political spectrum. The majority of MPs voted last night in favour of extending airstrikes, just like the ones against so-called Islamic State in Iraq, to Syria too, with 397 voting for and 223 disagreeing with the government's stance. It was this moment, though, and its aftermath, when Leeds Central's Hilary Benn made the case for action that's likely to be remembered. Even his opposite number in the Conservative Party was keen to admit that.
Secretary Philip Hammond. And Mr Speaker, I congratulate the Right Honourable Member for Leeds Central on an outstanding exposition of the case of the motion tonight. That will go down as one of the truly great speeches made in this House of Commons.
Hammond's and the government's stance on strikes was a clear one: to take all necessary measures to prevent terrorist acts by Daesh or IS, and the majority of Leeds MPs were of the same view. The three Conservatives in our patch, for Pudsey, Elmerton Rothwell and Morley and Outwood, voted, as you'd expect, in line with their party. Greg Mulholland, the only Lib Dem elected in Leeds, also voted for military action on behalf of his Leeds North West constituents, and surprise, surprise, Hilary Benn was a yes for Labour in Leeds Central. This left the three remaining no's, all from Labour: Rachel Reeves, Fabian Hamilton and Richard Bergen.
I think our military involvements in Syria would be welcomed by the extremists. I believe it would be welcomed by the terrorists. Why? Because I think it feeds their narrative that the West is engaged in some kind of crusade against the Muslim world.
Bergen's no vote aligned with the majority of his fellow Labour MPs nationally. 153 voted against airstrikes in Syria, with only 66 Labour MPs voting yes, led, many would say, by Hilary Benn, whose leader was visibly uncomfortable with what he had to say.
Being proposed. And of course we should take action. It is not a contradiction between the two to cut off Daesh's support in the form of money and fighters and weapons, and of course we should give humanitarian aid, and of course we should offer shelter to more refugees, including in this country, and yes, we should commit.
It's those comments about the broader strategy that begin to make this story even more important to Leeds. The wording of the motion passed last night includes a continuing commitment to providing humanitarian support to Syrian refugees fleeing the conflict, some of whom could and will end up in our city. But there's a maximum number.
We have a proud tradition of welcoming refugees to the city, and quite frankly, the city wouldn't be what it is today unless we'd have done that over the many years in our history. So we made the decision that we would offer the government our assistance as a local authority to help resettle up to 200 Syrian refugees over the next 5 years. So we were in negotiation with the Home Office as to how we might be able to achieve that.
The number of migrants seeking refuge from the Middle East at large is enormous. The so-called jungle camp in Calais gives just a snapshot insight into the sheer volume of those who say they need to leave their country behind and want to come to the UK.
We are here in Calais for many different reasons. Many people want to make a document here in France. For me, I want to go there because I have my brother in Leeds, Mr. Ayman, and I sent him migrating now in Leeds.
So is the council doing enough to make that happen, or should it be? It says the 200 number is the maximum number of Syrian refugees it can welcome to the city within the next 2 years. Budget constraints and questions over where refugees would stay, where they'd go to school and how their arrival would impact health services has to be considered. It's not a figure that all will agree on. That much has been clear already, with regular protests outside the Home Office base on Kirkstall Road pushing for less constraints, and others talking for tighter controls. What we do know for sure now is UK RAF bombs will, and have been today, dropping on IS targets in Syria. The aim in the long term is to eradicate IS militants, but the short-term effects of fleeing people as far as the Middle East, but as close as our own city, is wholly unclear. On the air, I'm Andy Seddon.
Well, we saw Councillor Cooper in that piece, and we'll be playing that full interview about the Council's position on refugees later in the programme. First, though, joining me to talk about the whole question of whether we do enough or even too much for refugees in Leeds are Lorna Gledhill from Regional Asylum Activism, a campaign group on asylum issues, and John Beach is the director of Leeds Asylum Seekers Support Network, which runs services and support, including a network of people who open their homes to refugees in the city. Thank you both for joining us. Thinking about those 200 refugees, how is that number? Is it too much? Is it too little? Is it about right?
Well, I think first off we need to kind of congratulate the council for signing up to this resettlement scheme. It's a really good step forward and a great starting point. But in the context of this global refugee crisis that we're seeing, with about 9 million Syrian refugees now, both in country and outside of country, 200 feels like quite a small number. And it's not the council's fault per se. I think it's something that needs to be looked at a national level. National government need to think about whether this 20,000 figure over 5 years is actually a sufficient
So do you
offer.
think that's too low?
Yeah, I do think it's too low. This is not to say that immediately Leeds City Council needs to up its number. I think it needs to be given the right funding and the right support to increase the number. But as I said before, I think it's a good starting point. But we should always be looking to do more. I don't think we can sit on our laurels and say we've done enough.
John, how do you feel about the 200 number?
I think 200 was a cautious number, and it was very clear from the council that they considered 200 in the next 2 years, and then they would reconsider. So it was a confident move to be able to say, we've got the schools, we've got the housing, we've got the medical support to be able to take some people, to be able to do a good job and to not put too much pressure on public services, which at the moment are under a lot of stress. So I think, as Lorna rightly says, it's a good start, and I think that the more support that we can give to the council, to the elected members, to go, that's great, you've done great so far, and what next? To help them to feel confident that the folk in Leeds are welcoming and supportive of people who've had a tough time a long way, far away, and have found their home in Leeds.
Because I think that's quite an important issue, isn't it, John? That it's we've got to make sure, from the council's perspective, they have to make sure that the refugees who come are settled and helped, but also for people can integrate into the community as well.
I think so, and there's a lot of care around how refugees are resettled, and the council are acutely aware that there are communities who are under pressure themselves, and they don't want to make life difficult for the communities, but also for the people that are coming to live there. They've got a great commitment to community cohesion, and we've done a good job of it in Leeds. We don't have huge amounts of tension that we've seen elsewhere in the country.
Tell us about that job that's happened in Leeds.
The way in which the council are resettling people.
Yeah, or organisations like yourselves, what you're doing.
So with refugees who are arriving, they get a package of wraparound care, which means that they have their health needs looked at, they have their that the kids are able to get into school, that their housing's sorted out. The idea is to basically patch folk up and get them into Leeds citizens as quickly as possible so that they can start to contribute. Many of the people that are coming over are very skilled, very able people, and the sooner we can help them to make a life in Leeds, contribute to the local economy and to become good, active citizens, the better. Everyone wants that for Leeds. Leeds has been built from refugees and on the backs of them, and I think that this is just a new chapter.
Of course, I've got a couple of the most famous refugees came to Leeds. Michael Marks, one of the founders of Marks and Spencer's. Montague Burton founded the Burton trade, as you say, kind of quite a history of that. But given that, Lorna, that still means that there are children need to go to schools. There are people need doctors and healthcare. Is that not putting the pressure on an already very stretched system?
I think, we're talking about this irrelevant figure that Nigel Farage is talking about. 200 people over 2 years is the figure that Leeds has gone for. Now, when I'm talking about increasing the numbers of resettlement, I'm not talking about millions, right? So if you're thinking about somewhere like Lebanon, a small country that borders Syria, which is actually the size of Cornwall, they have over 1 million Syrian refugees.
Hasn't their population gone up by 20% or something?
One in four people in Lebanon is a Syrian refugee. Now, I think we have to think about what the UK's role is in relation to this global crisis, and you know, it's a humanitarian response that we need to be thinking about, and obviously that needs to be tempered by concerns about access to public services. And yes, we don't want to have a resettlement programme which doesn't actually resettle people properly because we haven't thought ahead. But I'll go back to what I said before, we just need to be thinking about what more we can do. We're making great steps and we're thinking about it very well, and yes, the council's done a great job of thinking about how they can best settle people in Leeds, but we're a very diverse city. We've got great communities. We've got, you know, I think we've got the capacity to do it. And in other countries in Europe, for example, Germany, there's been a much more positive approach to the resettlement and arrival of refugees. And
we had this amazing scenes, didn't we, at this train station in Germany where ordinary German citizens were coming out and cheering the refugees coming through. Could you imagine that in Leeds station?
I think that we've seen over the last couple of months in Leeds a lot of people stepping forwards to say we want to be helpful and supportive. My organisation got more than 100 people.
You had to close the books, haven't
you? Yeah, it's been brilliant. It's been slightly embarrassing as well. So many people have wanted to say we want to open our homes. How can we help? One of the things that I think
we'll come back to how we can help in a minute, John. I'm afraid to say we need to go to a break now, but we'll come back to that. How can we help? We'll carry on talking about what we can do here in Leeds after the break. Don't go anywhere.